The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Millbrook when Sarah Chun first noticed her neighbor hadn't picked up her newspaper. Margaret Walsh, a 73-year-old retired teacher, was as predictable as clockwork. Every morning at 7 sharp, she would emerge from her small blue house, retrieve the paper, and wave to whoever happened to be passing by. But on this particular Tuesday in October, the newspaper lay untouched on her front porch. Sarah stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the Walsh house with growing concern. Margaret's car sat in the driveway, exactly where it had been the night before. The curtains remained drawn, and no lights flickered behind the windows. Something felt wrong. Sarah had lived next door to Margaret for 8 years, and in all that time, she had never known her to sleep past 6 in the morning. Margaret Walsh was the kind of woman who left an impression on everyone she met. Standing barely 5 feet tall with silver hair always perfectly styled, she possessed a fierce independence that both impressed and worried her neighbors. She had moved to Millbrook after her husband's death 15 years earlier, seeking the peace and quiet of small-town life after decades in the bustling city. The transition hadn't been easy, but Margaret had thrown herself into community activities with characteristic determination. She volunteered at the local library, organized charity drives for the animal shelter, and had single-handedly revived the town's annual Christmas festival. Her small house became a gathering place for neighborhood children who would stop by after school, drawn by the smell of fresh cookies and Margaret's endless supply of stories about her years as an elementary school teacher. She treated everyone with the same gentle firmness she had once used in her classroom, and the entire community had grown to love and respect her. But Margaret also had her secrets, shadows from a past that she rarely discussed. Those who knew her well understood that beneath her cheerful exterior lay deep wells of pain and resilience. She had survived more than most people could imagine, and the strength she displayed in her daily life was hard-earned through years of struggle and loss. The troubles had begun months earlier, though few people in Millbrook were aware of them at first. Margaret had started receiving strange phone calls at all hours of the day and night. The caller never spoke, simply breathing into the phone before hanging up. She had also noticed a dark sedan parked across from her house on several occasions, the driver's face hidden behind tinted windows. When she mentioned these incidents to her closest friend, Eleanor Hoffman, Margaret tried to brush them off as coincidences. "It's probably just teenagers playing pranks," she had said with a forced smile. "You know how kids can be these days." But Eleanor could see the worry lines deepening around Margaret's eyes, and she knew her friend well enough to recognize when something was truly troubling her. The harassment had escalated gradually. Margaret's mailbox was vandalized twice in 1 week, and her garden was trampled during the night. Someone had thrown eggs at her front door, leaving a mess that took hours to clean. She had called the police, but with no witnesses and little evidence, there wasn't much they could do beyond increasing patrols in the neighborhood. Detective James Morrison had been the officer assigned to Margaret's case. A 20-year veteran of the force with kind eyes and a patient manner, he had taken her concerns seriously when others might have dismissed them as the fears of an elderly woman living alone. He had visited her house multiple times, each time promising to do everything possible to find the person responsible for the harassment. "Mrs. Walsh," he had said during their last conversation, "I want you to call me immediately if anything else happens. Day or night, doesn't matter. These incidents are escalating, and I'm concerned about your safety." Margaret had thanked him and promised to be careful, but both of them knew that being careful might not be enough if someone was truly determined to hurt her. The final incident had occurred just 3 days before Margaret disappeared. She had been returning home from the grocery store when she noticed her front door standing wide open. Everything inside appeared normal at first glance, but as she looked more carefully, she realized that someone had been through her belongings. Nothing seemed to be missing, but drawers had been opened and closed, papers had been shuffled through, and her personal items had been handled by unfamiliar hands. That violation of her private space had shaken Margaret more than all the previous incidents combined. She had called Detective Morrison immediately, her voice trembling as she described what she had found. He had arrived within minutes, bringing a crime scene technician to dust for fingerprints and look for any evidence that might lead them to the intruder. Mrs. Walsh, I think it might be time to consider staying with friends or family for a while, Detective Morrison had suggested after completing his investigation. Just until we can figure out who's doing this and why. But Margaret had refused, her jaw set in the stubborn line that Eleanor knew meant her mind was made up. This is my home, Margaret had said firmly. I won't be driven out by some coward who picks on elderly women. I've survived worse than this, and I'll survive this too. Detective Morrison had admired her courage even as he worried about her safety. He had arranged for increased patrols past her house and had given her his personal cell phone number. But he knew that if someone was truly determined to harm her, there was only so much the police could do. The night Margaret disappeared had been unusually quiet in Millbrook. The autumn air was crisp and clear, with a full moon casting silver light across the sleeping town. Eleanor Hoffman had called Margaret around 9 o'clock to check on her, as she had been doing every evening since the break-in. Their conversation had been brief, but normal. Margaret had mentioned that she was settling in for the night with a cup of tea and a mystery novel. "I'll talk to you tomorrow, dear," Margaret had said before hanging up. Those would be the last words Eleanor would ever hear from her friend. Sarah Chun wasn't the only neighbor who noticed Margaret's absence the next morning. Tom Bradley, who delivered mail on Margaret Street, found it odd that her mailbox was still full from the previous day. Mrs. Henderson from across the street mentioned to her husband that she hadn't seen Margaret's usual morning routine. By noon, several neighbors had gathered on Margaret's front lawn, their concern growing with each passing hour. Eleanor Hoffman arrived at the house shortly after lunch, using the spare key Margaret had given her years earlier. The scene inside was both ordinary and deeply disturbing. Margaret's teacup still sat on the kitchen table, half full and cold. Her reading glasses lay open beside an unfinished crossword puzzle. Her bed appeared to have been slept in, but the covers were pulled back as if she had gotten up in the middle of the night. Her purse sat on the dresser with her wallet and keys inside, and all her medications remained in the bathroom cabinet. The house showed no signs of a struggle, no broken furniture or overturned objects. But Margaret was simply gone, as if she had vanished into the night air. Eleanor called the police immediately, her hands shaking as she dialed the number Detective Morrison had given Margaret. The initial police response was swift and thorough. Detective Morrison arrived within minutes of Eleanor's call, followed by several other officers and a crime scene team. They searched every inch of Margaret's house and the surrounding property, looking for any clue that might explain her disappearance. They interviewed neighbors, checked security cameras from nearby businesses, and began the process of tracking Margaret's last known movements. The investigation revealed troubling details that painted a picture of a woman who had been living in fear during her final days. Hidden in Margaret's bedroom closet, investigators found a small notebook where she had been documenting the harassment she had been experiencing. The entries detailed incidents that she had never reported to police, incidents that showed the pattern of intimidation had been far more extensive than anyone had realized. The notebook contained dates, times, and detailed descriptions of suspicious activity around her home. Margaret had noticed the same car parked on her street on numerous occasions, always at different times and locations, but always positioned where the occupant could watch her house. She had documented phone calls that came at regular intervals, hang-ups that occurred whenever she answered. Most disturbing of all, she had recorded evidence that someone had been entering her house when she wasn't home, moving small objects and leaving subtle signs of their presence. The final entry in the notebook was dated 2 days before her disappearance. In Margaret's careful handwriting were the words, "They're getting bolder. I found my kitchen window unlocked this morning, and I know I secured it last night. I'm scared, but I won't run. If something happens to me, look for the truth in the place where we used to feed the ducks." The entry ended there, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Detective Morrison felt a chill as he read Margaret's final words. The reference to feeding ducks could mean Millbrook Lake, a popular spot where Margaret had been known to take her grandchildren during their visits. The lake was surrounded by dense woods and had several secluded areas where someone could commit a crime without being observed. The detective immediately organized a search team to scour the lake and the surrounding forest. The search of Millbrook Lake began at dawn the next day and continued for 3 days. Divers explored every section of the murky water while search teams combed through the thick undergrowth along the shoreline. They found old fishing equipment, discarded bottles, and the remnants of illegal campfires, but no trace of Margaret Walsh. The official search was called off after a week, but volunteers from the community continued looking for months afterward. As weeks turned into months, Margaret's disappearance became the mystery that haunted Millbrook. Theories and rumors circulated through the small town like wildfire. Some people believed she had been the victim of a random crime, perhaps killed during a robbery gone wrong. Others suspected that her harassment had escalated to murder, carried out by someone with a personal grudge against the elderly woman. A few optimistic souls held on to the hope that she had suffered some kind of medical emergency and was lying unconscious somewhere, waiting to be found. Eleanor Hoffman never gave up believing that her friend was still alive somewhere, somehow. She organized weekly search parties that combed through different sections of the county, following up on every tip and investigating every possible lead. She put up missing person posters throughout the region and maintained a constant presence on social media, sharing Margaret's photo and story in hopes that someone, somewhere, had seen something that could help solve the mystery. The official investigation continued for months, but without new evidence or witnesses, the case gradually grew cold. Detective Morrison never closed the file completely, continuing to follow up on occasional tips and reviewing the evidence whenever he had time. He had developed a personal connection to the case, unable to forget the brave elderly woman who had refused to be intimidated by her tormentors. He kept Margaret's notebook in his desk drawer, reading through her final entries whenever a new lead emerged. Winter came and went, bringing with it the harsh reality that Margaret was most likely dead. The harassment that had plagued her final months seemed to have stopped completely after her disappearance, leading investigators to believe that whoever was responsible had gotten what they wanted. The small blue house where Margaret had lived sat empty and dark, a constant reminder to the neighborhood of the woman who had been taken from them. As spring arrived and the anniversary of Margaret's disappearance approached, the people of Millbrook had begun to accept that they might never know what had happened to their beloved neighbor. The case had been featured in regional newspapers and on local television news programs, but no new information had emerged. The mystery seemed destined to join the ranks of unsolved disappearances that plague small towns across the country. But sometimes, truth has a way of surfacing when it's least expected, emerging from dark places to finally bring justice to those who have waited so long for answers. The revelation that would soon shake the foundations of Millbrook was still months away, hidden beneath the calm waters of the lake where Margaret Walsh had once fed ducks with her grandchildren on sunny summer afternoons. The unusually hot summer had been hard on Millbrook Lake. Water levels had dropped significantly due to the drought that had gripped the region for 3 consecutive months. What had once been a thriving recreational area now looked like a shadow of its former self, with exposed shoreline revealing decades of discarded items that had been hidden beneath the surface. Local environmental groups had organized cleanup efforts, hoping to restore some of the lake's natural beauty while the low water levels made it easier to remove debris. Michael Torres was 16 years old and working his first summer job with the County Parks Department. He had volunteered for the lake cleanup project because it paid better than flipping burgers, and he enjoyed being outdoors rather than stuck behind a counter all day. The work was physically demanding but satisfying, as he watched the lake slowly return to its natural state with each bag of trash they removed from the exposed lakebed. On a sweltering Thursday morning in late August, nearly 11 months after Margaret Walsh had disappeared, Michael was working along the eastern shore of the lake. This section had been underwater for as long as anyone could remember, and the newly exposed ground was soft and muddy, making it difficult to walk without sinking ankle-deep into the muck. He had been assigned to this area because he was young and agile, better able to navigate the treacherous terrain than some of the older volunteers. The discovery came as Michael was trying to extract what appeared to be an old tire from the mud. As he pulled on the rubber, something heavy shifted beneath the surface, and he realized that the tire was attached to something much larger. His first thought was that he had found an old motorcycle or bicycle that had been dumped in the lake years earlier. But as he cleared away more mud and debris, the shape that emerged made his blood run cold. Protruding from the dark sediment was what was unmistakably a human hand, the flesh long since decomposed, but the bones still held together by remnants of clothing. Michael stumbled backward, his heart pounding as he tried to process what he was seeing. He had found other disturbing things during the cleanup: dead fish, decaying animals, and plenty of unpleasant debris, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Michael's supervisor, Janet Walsh, was working about 50 yards away when she heard him calling for help. The urgency in his voice brought her running across the uneven ground, and she immediately understood the gravity of the situation when she saw the young man's pale face and shaking hands. Janet had been with the Parks Department for 15 years and had dealt with her share of emergencies, but discovering human remains was something that would test even her experienced composure. "Don't touch anything else," Janet instructed Michael as she pulled out her cell phone to call 911. "We need to secure this area immediately and let the proper authorities handle the investigation." She could see that more of the skeleton was visible beneath the mud, and her mind immediately went to Margaret Walsh, the elderly woman who had disappeared from the community nearly a year earlier. The location was exactly where many people had suspected she might be found, but the drought had been necessary to finally reveal the truth. Detective James Morrison received the call while he was finishing lunch at his desk. The words "human remains found at Millbrook Lake" sent electricity through his entire body, and he knew immediately that this discovery was likely connected to the case that had haunted him for months. He had driven past the lake countless times during the past year, often stopping to walk along the shore and wonder if Margaret Walsh was somewhere beneath those dark waters. Now it seemed that his instincts had been correct. The crime scene at the lake was unlike anything the Millbrook Police Department had encountered before. The remains were partially buried in thick mud that had been underwater for nearly a year, making the recovery process extremely difficult and time-consuming. The county coroner was called in, along with specialists in underwater crime scene investigation who had experience dealing with bodies that had been submerged for extended periods. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the county's chief medical examiner, arrived at the scene within 2 hours of the discovery. A forensic pathologist with 25 years of experience, she had seen every type of death imaginable, but cases involving elderly victims always affected her deeply. As she examined the remains in their muddy resting place, she could see that this had not been a natural death or accidental drowning. The skeleton was found in an unnatural position, with the arms bound behind the back using what appeared to be rope or heavy cord that had partially decomposed over the months underwater. Most disturbing of all, there were clear signs that heavy objects had been tied to the body, exactly as described in the case that had captured the community's imagination. Several large stones were found near the skeleton, along with remnants of rope and what looked like pieces of chain that had been used to weigh down the body. As the careful excavation process continued throughout the afternoon, more evidence emerged that painted a horrifying picture of Margaret Walsh's final moments. The position of the remains suggested that she had been alive when she entered the water, her bound hands indicating that she had been unable to save herself from drowning. The stones and chains had been carefully arranged to ensure that the body would sink quickly and remain hidden beneath the surface indefinitely. Detective Morrison stood at the edge of the crime scene, watching the recovery process with a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that Margaret's family and friends would finally have answers about her fate, and anger at the cruelty that had been inflicted upon an innocent elderly woman. The evidence was already pointing toward premeditated murder rather than a crime of passion, suggesting that someone had carefully planned Margaret's death and taken steps to ensure that her body would never be found. The news of the discovery spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Eleanor Hoffman, Margaret's closest friend, received a call from Detective Morrison personally, who wanted to make sure she heard the news from him rather than through the rumor mill that was already churning through the small town. Eleanor had been expecting this call for months, but when it finally came, she found herself unprepared for the wave of emotions that washed over her. Grief, anger, and a strange sense of closure all competed for space in her heart as she processed the reality that her friend was truly gone. The recovery of Margaret's remains took 3 full days to complete. Every bone had to be carefully cataloged and photographed before being removed from its muddy resting place. The ropes and chains were collected as evidence, along with samples of the mud and sediment that surrounded the body. The medical examiner's team worked with painstaking precision, knowing that this evidence would be crucial in bringing Margaret's killer to justice. During the recovery process, investigators made another significant discovery that would prove crucial to solving the case. Hidden beneath Margaret's body, preserved by the mud and lack of oxygen, was her purse. The leather bag had deteriorated significantly during its time underwater, but many of its contents remained intact. Inside, investigators found Margaret's driver's license, credit cards, and a small amount of cash, proving beyond doubt that this had not been a robbery gone wrong. More importantly, they found Margaret's cell phone, its battery long dead, but the device itself still intact enough that digital forensics experts believe they might be able to recover data from its memory. The phone had been in Margaret's possession when she died, suggesting that she might have tried to call for help during her final moments. If the experts could recover call logs, text messages, or other data from the device, it might provide crucial clues about Margaret's killer. The autopsy conducted by Dr. Reynolds revealed the full extent of the cruelty that had been inflicted upon Margaret Walsh. The elderly woman had suffered multiple injuries before her death, including evidence of being struck repeatedly about the head and face. The pattern of injuries suggested that she had been beaten systematically rather than killed in a moment of rage. Most heartbreaking of all, the condition of her lungs indicated that she had been alive when she entered the water, meaning she had drowned while bound and weighted down. This was not a quick death, Dr. Reynolds explained to Detective Morrison during their meeting to review the autopsy results. Mrs. Walsh suffered significantly before she died. The injuries she sustained would have been painful but not immediately fatal, and the evidence suggests she was conscious when she was thrown into the lake. The medical examiner's words hit the detective like a physical blow as he imagined the terror and pain that Margaret had endured in her final moments. The forensic analysis of the ropes and chains used to bind and weight Margaret's body provided several important clues about her killer. The rope was a common type available at hardware stores throughout the region, but the chain was more distinctive. It was heavy-duty marine chain of the type used for boat anchors, and investigators began checking marinas and boat supply stores to see if they could trace its origin. The way the knots were tied also suggested that the killer had some knowledge of seamanship or outdoor activities. As news of the discovery spread beyond Millbrook, the case began attracting attention from regional and even national media outlets. The story of an elderly woman being bound, weighted down, and thrown into a lake struck a chord with people across the country who were horrified by the cruelty of the crime. Margaret's photo appeared on television screens and newspaper front pages, often accompanied by the phrase that would become associated with her case. They tied a stone to her feet and threw her in the lake. The increased media attention brought both benefits and challenges to the investigation. Tips and leads began pouring in from across the region as people who had seen suspicious activity around the time of Margaret's disappearance came forward with information they hadn't thought important before. But the publicity also brought out conspiracy theorists and attention seekers who provided false leads that had to be investigated and eliminated, taking valuable time and resources away from legitimate aspects of the case. Detective Morrison found himself working 18-hour days as he tried to follow up on every lead and piece of evidence. The pressure from the community, the media, and his own conscience was enormous. Margaret Walsh had been a beloved member of the Millbrook community, and everyone was demanding justice for the brutal crime that had been committed against her. The detective knew that finding her killer was probably the most important case of his career, and he was determined not to let Margaret down again. The digital forensics analysis of Margaret's cell phone proved to be one of the most crucial breakthroughs in the case. Despite having been submerged for nearly a year, experts were able to recover significant data from the device's memory. The call log showed that Margaret had made 2 phone calls on the night she disappeared, both to the same number. When investigators traced that number, they discovered it belonged to someone with a direct connection to Margaret's past, someone who had reasons to want the elderly woman dead. The text message history revealed even more disturbing information. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Margaret had been receiving threatening messages from an unknown number. The texts started with vague warnings about keeping quiet and escalated to specific threats against her life. The final message, sent just hours before she disappeared, contained the chilling words, "Tonight you pay for what you did. No one will ever find you." Armed with this new evidence, investigators began tracing the source of the threatening text messages. The process was complicated by the fact that the messages had been sent from a prepaid cell phone that had been purchased with cash, making it difficult to identify the buyer. But phone companies keep detailed records of when and where their devices connect to cellular towers, creating a digital trail that could potentially lead investigators to the killer. The cell tower data showed that the threatening text messages had been sent from locations throughout Millbrook and the surrounding area over a period of several weeks. The pattern suggested that whoever was sending the messages was familiar with Margaret's routine and had been watching her for an extended period before finally acting on their threats. Most significantly, the final message had been sent from a location very close to Margaret's house, indicating that the killer had been nearby when they decided to carry out their plan. As investigators dug deeper into the digital evidence, they also began examining Margaret's past more carefully than ever before. The threatening messages had mentioned something she had done in the past, suggesting that her murder might have been motivated by revenge rather than random violence. Detective Morrison began interviewing Margaret's friends and family members again, this time asking specifically about any conflicts or problems she might have had with other people during her lifetime. Eleanor Hoffman proved to be an invaluable source of information about Margaret's history. During their decades of friendship, Margaret had confided many details about her past that she had never shared with others. Some of these stories involved difficult periods in Margaret's life, times when she had been forced to make decisions that might have created lasting enemies. One story in particular caught Detective Morrison's attention, a tale of betrayal and justice that had occurred many years earlier but whose consequences might have finally caught up with Margaret in her final months. The investigation was entering a new phase, one that would require investigators to delve deep into Margaret Walsh's past to understand why someone had wanted her dead. The discovery of her body had answered the question of what had happened to her, but the more difficult question of who was responsible and why they had killed her was still waiting to be solved. The truth, when it finally emerged, would shock the community of Millbrook and reveal secrets that had been buried for decades, waiting for the right moment to surface and demand justice for an innocent woman whose only crime had been knowing too much about someone else's guilt. The breakthrough that would ultimately solve Margaret Walsh's murder came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after her body was discovered, Detective Morrison received a call from a woman named Linda Peterson, who lived 200 miles away in the state capital. Linda had been following the case in the news and believed she had information that might be relevant to the investigation. She claimed to have known Margaret decades earlier, when they had both worked at the same elementary school in a different district. Linda's story began in 1987, when she and Margaret had been teaching at Riverside Elementary School in the suburban community of Oakdale. Both women were in their 40s at the time, experienced educators who took pride in their work and genuinely cared about their students. The school was located in a middle-class neighborhood where most of the children came from stable, supportive families, making it an ideal environment for dedicated teachers like Margaret and Linda. The principal of Riverside Elementary was a man named Robert Crawford, who had been running the school for nearly 15 years when Margaret and Linda arrived as new faculty members. Crawford was well-respected in the community and had a reputation as an innovative educator who had transformed the school into one of the highest performing in the district. He was married with 2 young children of his own and seemed to embody the values of dedication and integrity that the school board wanted to promote. But beneath Crawford's polished exterior lay a much darker reality that Margaret Walsh would eventually uncover. During her second year at Riverside Elementary, Margaret began noticing troubling patterns in Crawford's behavior around certain female students. The signs were subtle at first: inappropriate comments about girls' appearances, unnecessary physical contact during hallway interactions, and a tendency to keep particular students after class for extended periods without clear educational justification. Margaret's concerns deepened when she overheard Crawford making sexually suggestive remarks about several of his female students to another male teacher. The comments were disguised as jokes, but Margaret recognized them for what they really were: expressions of predatory intent toward children who were supposed to be under his protection. As a veteran teacher with decades of experience working with children, Margaret knew the warning signs of inappropriate adult behavior, and everything about Crawford's conduct raised red flags in her mind. The situation came to a head when 10-year-old Jessica Murphy, one of Margaret's favorite students, approached her after school one day in tears. Jessica was normally a confident, outgoing child, but on this particular afternoon she seemed frightened and confused. Through gentle questioning, Margaret learned that Principal Crawford had been calling Jessica to his office regularly, ostensibly to help her with academic work. But during these sessions he had been touching her inappropriately and making her promise not to tell anyone about their special time together. Margaret's heart broke as she listened to Jessica's halting description of what Crawford had been doing to her. The child didn't fully understand the nature of the abuse she was experiencing, but she knew that something was wrong and that the principal's behavior made her feel scared and uncomfortable. Margaret immediately reassured Jessica that she had done nothing wrong and promised to make sure that Crawford never hurt her again. The decision to report Crawford's abuse was not an easy one for Margaret. She knew that accusations against a respected administrator would be met with skepticism and potentially destroy her own career if they weren't handled properly. But she also knew that she had a moral obligation to protect Jessica and any other children who might be suffering in silence. Margaret spent a sleepless night considering her options before deciding that she had no choice but to take action. Margaret first approached Linda Peterson, hoping to find an ally who might have noticed similar warning signs about Crawford's behavior. Linda admitted that she had observed some troubling interactions between the principal and female students, but had convinced herself that she was overreacting. Together, the two women decided to document everything they had observed and gather as much evidence as possible before making formal accusations. Over the next several weeks, Margaret and Linda conducted a careful investigation into Crawford's conduct. They spoke quietly with other teachers and staff members, asking indirect questions about the principal's behavior and noting any concerns that were expressed. They also began paying closer attention to Crawford's interactions with students, documenting incidents that seemed inappropriate or concerning. The evidence they gathered painted a disturbing picture of systematic abuse that had likely been going on for years. Several teachers mentioned that they had noticed Crawford's tendency to single out attractive female students for special attention. The school secretary revealed that she had questioned why the principal kept certain girls in his office for such long periods, often with the door closed and the blinds drawn. A janitor mentioned finding Crawford alone with students in empty classrooms after hours on multiple occasions. Most damning of all, Margaret and Linda discovered that Crawford had been using his position to manipulate vulnerable children from troubled home situations. He would identify girls who were struggling academically or emotionally and offer them special help and attention. These children, hungry for adult approval and support, were easy targets for his predatory behavior. By the time Margaret and Linda completed their investigation, they had identified at least 6 potential victims, all girls between the ages of 8 and 12. Armed with their evidence, Margaret and Linda approached the school district's superintendent with their concerns about Principal Crawford. The meeting was tense and uncomfortable, as the superintendent clearly didn't want to believe that one of his most respected administrators could be guilty of such serious crimes. He questioned Margaret and Linda extensively about their allegations, suggesting that they might have misinterpreted innocent interactions or allowed their imaginations to run wild. Despite the superintendent's initial skepticism, Margaret and Linda refused to back down. They presented their documented evidence methodically and professionally, making it clear that they would not be silenced or discouraged from pursuing justice for the children who had been victimized. Margaret in particular was passionate in her advocacy for the victims, drawing on her years of experience as an educator to explain how Crawford's behavior fit the classic patterns of institutional child abuse. The investigation that followed Margaret's report was thorough and devastating for Crawford. Child Protective Services became involved, and forensic interviews were conducted with the suspected victims. One by one, the children confirmed the allegations that Margaret and Linda had made, providing detailed accounts of the abuse they had suffered at the hands of their principal. The evidence was overwhelming, and Crawford was ultimately charged with multiple counts of child sexual abuse. The trial that followed was a media sensation that rocked the quiet community of Oakdale. Crawford maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, claiming that he was the victim of a conspiracy by disgruntled teachers who wanted to destroy his career. His defense attorney attempted to portray Margaret and Linda as troublemakers who had blown innocent interactions out of proportion and convinced vulnerable children to make false accusations. But the jury saw through Crawford's lies and the manipulative tactics of his defense team. The testimony of the child victims was powerful and heartbreaking, leaving no doubt that they had suffered real trauma at the hands of someone they should have been able to trust. Margaret's testimony was particularly compelling, as she explained how her protective instincts as both a teacher and a mother had driven her to investigate Crawford's behavior despite the personal and professional risks involved. Robert Crawford was ultimately convicted on 8 counts of child sexual abuse and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The verdict was a victory for justice and for the brave children who had found the courage to speak out against their abuser. Margaret Walsh was widely praised for her courage in reporting Crawford's crimes and her dedication to protecting vulnerable children. The school district implemented new policies and procedures designed to prevent similar abuse from occurring in the future. But Margaret's role in exposing Crawford created a powerful enemy who would never forgive her for destroying his life and career. Crawford's family, particularly his brother David, refused to accept that the conviction was justified. They believed that Margaret had orchestrated a vindictive campaign against an innocent man, destroying not just Crawford's life, but the lives of his wife and children as well. The hatred that festered in David Crawford's heart would simmer for decades, waiting for the right opportunity to exact revenge against the woman he blamed for his brother's downfall. David Crawford was a commercial fisherman who had spent most of his adult life working on boats along the Great Lakes. Unlike his brother, he had never been interested in education or working with children, preferring the solitary life of a man who made his living from the water. He was skilled with ropes and chains, comfortable with the equipment needed to secure heavy loads and anchor boats in deep water. Most importantly, he knew how to make things disappear beneath the surface of a lake so that they would never be found again. After his brother's conviction, David Crawford had made several attempts to contact Margaret Walsh directly, hoping to convince her to recant her testimony or admit that she had fabricated evidence against Robert. When Margaret refused to speak with him and eventually obtained a restraining order to keep him away from her, David's anger transformed into something much darker and more dangerous. He began following Margaret's life from a distance, learning about her routines and relationships while nurturing his desire for revenge. When Margaret moved to Millbrook after her husband's death, David Crawford tracked her down within months. He rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town under a false name and began the patient process of learning everything he could about Margaret's new life. He discovered her daily routines, her friendships with neighbors like Eleanor Hoffman, and her volunteer activities throughout the community. Most importantly, he identified the vulnerabilities that would allow him to get close enough to carry out his revenge. The campaign of harassment that had terrorized Margaret during her final months had been carefully orchestrated by David Crawford. The anonymous phone calls, the vandalism, the break-ins, all of it had been designed to make Margaret feel isolated and afraid while gradually escalating toward the ultimate goal of murder. Crawford had used his knowledge of Margaret's past to craft threatening messages that referenced her role in his brother's conviction, making it clear that her actions decades earlier had finally caught up with her. Detective Morrison felt a chill of recognition as Linda Peterson described David Crawford and his connection to Margaret's past. The description of a man skilled with marine equipment matched perfectly with the evidence found at Margaret's crime scene, the professional-grade anchor chain and expertly tied knots that had been used to weight down her body. More importantly, cell phone records showed that someone matching Crawford's description had been in the Millbrook area during the weeks leading up to Margaret's disappearance. The investigation into David Crawford moved quickly once detectives knew who they were looking for. Records showed that he had indeed rented a cabin outside Millbrook under the name David Johnson, paying cash for 6 months in advance. The landlord confirmed that the tenant had driven a dark sedan and kept unusual hours, often leaving for days at a time before returning without explanation. Security camera footage from a nearby gas station showed a man matching Crawford's description purchasing marine supplies just days before Margaret disappeared. The breakthrough that sealed Crawford's fate came when investigators searched the abandoned cabin where he had been staying. Hidden in a storage shed behind the building, they found Margaret Walsh's jewelry, including a distinctive antique brooch that Eleanor Hoffman immediately recognized as one of her friend's most treasured possessions. The shed also contained rope and chain identical to what had been used to bind and weight Margaret's body, along with detailed maps of Millbrook Lake that showed depth measurements and secluded access points. Most damning of all, investigators found Crawford's computer, which contained extensive research about Margaret's life in Millbrook. The hard drive revealed months of surveillance and planning, including photographs of Margaret's house taken from various angles and detailed schedules of her daily activities. There were also draft versions of the threatening text messages that had been sent to Margaret's phone, showing how Crawford had refined his intimidation tactics over time. The digital evidence painted a picture of a man consumed by hatred and dedicated to exacting revenge for his brother's conviction decades earlier. Crawford had spent years planning Margaret's murder, carefully studying her routines and vulnerabilities while waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The harassment campaign had been designed to isolate Margaret from her support system and make her death seem like the result of random violence rather than a carefully planned execution. When detectives finally located David Crawford, he was living under another false identity in a small fishing village 3 states away. He had clearly been prepared to disappear permanently after killing Margaret, but the discovery of her body had forced him to run sooner than planned. The arrest was swift and without incident, as Crawford seemed almost relieved that his long campaign of revenge had finally come to an end. During his interrogation, Crawford initially denied any involvement in Margaret's disappearance, claiming that he had never heard of her and had no connection to Millbrook. But when confronted with the overwhelming evidence against him, the jewelry, the computer files, the witness identifications, his facade crumbled completely. The confession that followed was cold and calculating, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who felt completely justified in his actions. Crawford explained how he had spent decades nursing his hatred for Margaret Walsh, blaming her for destroying his brother's life and reputation. He described the months of planning that had gone into Margaret's murder, from learning her routines to acquiring the equipment needed to dispose of her body. Most chilling of all, he showed no remorse for the terror and pain he had inflicted upon an innocent elderly woman, viewing her death as justified payback for the harm she had caused his family. The revelation of Crawford's motive sent shockwaves through both Millbrook and the community of Oakdale where the original abuse had occurred. Margaret Walsh had been murdered not by a random criminal or deranged stranger, but by a man seeking revenge for her heroic actions in protecting children from a sexual predator. Her dedication to justice and child welfare had ultimately cost her life, making her both a victim and a hero whose sacrifice had saved countless other children from similar abuse. The arrest of David Crawford brought closure to the mystery that had haunted Millbrook for over a year, but it also raised troubling questions about the price of doing the right thing in a world where evil people hold grudges for decades. Margaret Walsh had died because she had chosen to protect vulnerable children rather than look the other way when confronted with evidence of abuse. Her murder was a reminder that heroes sometimes pay the ultimate price for their courage, but that their actions continue to inspire others long after their deaths. The trial of David Crawford began 18 months after Margaret Walsh's body was discovered in Millbrook Lake. The case had garnered national attention, transforming the small town into a focal point for discussions about justice, revenge, and the courage required to protect vulnerable children. Media outlets from across the country descended upon the courthouse, drawn by the compelling story of an elderly woman murdered for her heroic actions decades earlier. Prosecutor Amanda Richardson had built her career handling complex criminal cases, but the Crawford trial represented something different. A chance to seek justice for a woman whose only crime had been protecting children from a sexual predator. Richardson knew that the evidence against Crawford was overwhelming, but she also understood that the defense would try to portray their client as a grieving brother driven to madness by what he perceived as an injustice against his family. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over 3 weeks, with each piece of evidence building upon the last to create an unshakable foundation of guilt. Richardson began by establishing Margaret Walsh's character and the circumstances of her disappearance, painting a picture of a beloved community member who had been systematically terrorized before being brutally murdered. The testimony of Margaret's friends and neighbors brought many spectators to tears as they heard about the final months of fear and harassment that had plagued the elderly woman. Detective Morrison took the stand on the second day of the trial, walking the jury through the investigation that had ultimately led to Crawford's arrest. His testimony was detailed and professional, but observers could see the emotion in his eyes as he described finding Margaret's body weighted down with chains and stones. The detective explained how the digital evidence had revealed the extent of Crawford's planning and surveillance, showing that Margaret's murder had been a calculated act of revenge rather than a crime of passion. The forensic evidence presented by Dr. Patricia Reynolds was particularly damning for Crawford's defense. The medical examiner's testimony about Margaret's injuries and the manner of her death left no doubt that she had suffered tremendously in her final moments. The fact that Margaret had been alive when she entered the water, bound, and weighted down to ensure she would drown, demonstrated a level of cruelty that shocked even experienced court watchers. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Linda Peterson, Margaret's former colleague who had originally contacted police with information about Crawford's motive for murder. Linda's account of the events at Riverside Elementary School 3 decades earlier provided crucial context for understanding why Crawford had targeted Margaret for revenge. Her description of Margaret's courage in exposing Robert Crawford's abuse of children painted a picture of a hero who had sacrificed her own safety to protect the innocent. The prosecution also presented testimony from some of Robert Crawford's victims, now adults who had found the courage to speak about their experiences. Their accounts of the abuse they had suffered as children were heartbreaking, but they also served to highlight the importance of Margaret's actions in stopping their tormentor. These witnesses made it clear that Margaret Walsh had saved other children from similar trauma, making her subsequent murder even more tragic and senseless. Crawford's defense attorney, Marcus Kellerman, faced an almost impossible task in trying to create reasonable doubt about his client's guilt. The evidence against Crawford was overwhelming, from the physical evidence found at his hideout to the digital trail that documented his months of planning and surveillance. Kellerman's strategy focused on portraying Crawford as a man driven to temporary insanity by grief and anger over his brother's conviction and subsequent death in prison. Kellerman argued that Crawford had genuinely believed his brother was innocent and that Margaret Walsh had orchestrated a conspiracy to destroy an innocent man's life and career. The defense presented evidence of Robert Crawford's declining health in prison and his eventual death from a heart attack, suggesting that David Crawford's actions were driven by overwhelming grief rather than calculated malice. The attorney portrayed his client as a broken man who had lost his way after losing the brother he had idolized since childhood. The defense also attempted to argue that Margaret's murder had been unpremeditated, claiming that Crawford had only intended to confront her about her role in his brother's conviction. According to this version of events, the murder had occurred during a struggle when Margaret had tried to flee, and Crawford had acted impulsively in restraining her and disposing of her body. Kellerman argued that while his client was guilty of manslaughter, the charges of premeditated murder were not supported by the evidence. But Prosecutor Richardson systematically dismantled the defense's arguments during her cross-examination of Crawford himself. When the defendant took the stand in his own defense, Richardson presented him with the extensive evidence of planning and premeditation that investigators had uncovered. The months of surveillance, the threatening text messages, the purchase of specific equipment for binding and weighting a body, all of it pointed to a carefully orchestrated murder rather than a crime of passion. Richardson's cross-examination of Crawford was masterful, as she forced him to confront the evidence of his elaborate planning while maintaining his claim that Margaret's death had been unintentional. The prosecutor walked Crawford through his purchase of marine equipment weeks before the murder, his rental of a cabin under a false name, and his detailed surveillance of Margaret's daily routines. By the time the cross-examination was complete, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that Crawford's claims of acting impulsively were completely false. The most powerful moment in the trial came when Richardson presented Crawford with Margaret's notebook, the one that had been found in her closet documenting the harassment she had endured. Reading Margaret's own words about her fear and determination not to be driven from her home brought a hush to the courtroom as people realized the extent of her suffering during her final months. Crawford's visible discomfort when confronted with the evidence of Margaret's terror served to highlight his complete lack of remorse for his actions. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with their verdict. David Crawford was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and stalking. The verdict was met with applause from Margaret's friends and supporters who had filled the courtroom throughout the trial. Eleanor Hoffman, who had attended every day of the proceedings, wept openly as she realized that her friend would finally receive the justice she deserved. Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Crawford to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling his crime one of the most calculated and cruel acts of revenge she had encountered in 30 years on the bench. The judge noted that Margaret Walsh had been killed not for any wrongdoing on her part, but for her courage in protecting innocent children from abuse. She described Crawford's actions as an attack not just on Margaret, but on the principle that people should be able to speak out against injustice without fear of deadly retaliation. In her victim impact statement read at sentencing, Eleanor Hoffman spoke eloquently about the woman Margaret Walsh had been and the impact her death had on everyone who knew her. She described Margaret's dedication to children, her kindness toward neighbors, and her unwavering moral courage in the face of threats and intimidation. Eleanor's words painted a picture of a life well lived and a death that represented an immeasurable loss to the community. The resolution of Margaret's case brought closure to Millbrook, but it also sparked important conversations about the protection of whistleblowers and those who speak out against abuse. Margaret's story became a rallying cry for advocates working to protect children and support adults who risk their own safety to report abuse. Her name was attached to legislation in several states that strengthened protections for mandated reporters and increased penalties for retaliating against those who report suspected child abuse. The children that Margaret had protected at Riverside Elementary School, now adults with children of their own, organized a scholarship fund in her memory to support students pursuing careers in education and child protection. The fund ensured that Margaret's legacy would live on through future generations of teachers and social workers who shared her commitment to protecting vulnerable children. The scholarship recipients were required to write essays about courage and moral responsibility, ensuring that Margaret's story and values would continue to inspire others. Millbrook Lake, once the site of tragedy and horror, was transformed into a memorial space honoring Margaret's life and sacrifice. The community installed a bench overlooking the water where Margaret had once fed ducks with her grandchildren, creating a peaceful place for reflection and remembrance. A plaque on the bench read simply, "Margaret Walsh, teacher, friend, hero. She gave her life protecting children." The memorial became a place where people could come to remember not just Margaret, but all those who risked their own safety to protect others. The house where Margaret had lived was eventually donated to a nonprofit organization that provides temporary housing for families of children who have been abused. The organization renovated the building and created a safe, welcoming environment where parents and siblings could stay while their children received treatment and testified in court proceedings. The transformation of Margaret's home into a sanctuary for other families affected by abuse seemed like a fitting tribute to a woman who had dedicated her life to protecting children. Detective Morrison, who had been haunted by Margaret's case for months, found peace in the knowledge that justice had been served. He kept a photo of Margaret on his desk as a reminder of the importance of never giving up on victims, no matter how cold their cases might become. The detective often reflected on how the drought that had lowered the lake's water level had finally allowed Margaret to tell her story and identify her killer, as if nature itself had conspired to ensure that the truth would eventually surface. The Riverside Elementary School where Margaret had taught and exposed Robert Crawford's abuse was eventually renamed the Margaret Walsh Elementary School in her honor. The school board felt it was important to acknowledge the courage Margaret had shown in protecting their students, even though it had ultimately cost her life. A portrait of Margaret was hung in the main hallway, serving as a daily reminder to students and staff about the importance of speaking up when something is wrong. Linda Peterson, who had worked alongside Margaret to expose Robert Crawford's crimes, became an advocate for teacher training programs focused on recognizing and reporting child abuse. She traveled across the country sharing Margaret's story and teaching educators how to identify warning signs of abuse and respond appropriately when children reach out for help. Linda often said that Margaret's death had given her a mission to ensure that her friend's sacrifice would prevent other children from suffering in silence. Eleanor Hoffman continued to live next door to Margaret's former home, watching over the families who stayed there and sharing stories about her friend with anyone who would listen. She maintained Margaret's garden, ensuring that the flowers Margaret had loved continued to bloom each spring as a living tribute to her memory. Eleanor often said that she could still feel Margaret's presence in the garden, particularly when the roses were in full bloom and the air was filled with their fragrance. The case of Margaret Walsh became a landmark example in law enforcement training programs, demonstrating the importance of taking seriously complaints from elderly victims who report harassment or stalking. Her story was used to teach officers about the patterns of escalating violence and the need to recognize when seemingly minor incidents might be building towards something more serious. Margaret's case helped save other lives by educating law enforcement about the warning signs that had been present in the months before her murder. Years after Crawford's conviction, the truth about Margaret Walsh's life and death continued to inspire people around the world. Her story was featured in documentaries, books, and television programs that highlighted the courage required to protect children from abuse. Margaret became a symbol of moral courage, representing all those who choose to speak up for the powerless even when doing so puts them at risk. The phrase "they tied a stone to her feet" and "threw her in the lake" became synonymous with Margaret's story, serving as a stark reminder of the price that heroes sometimes pay for their courage. But those who truly understood Margaret's life knew that the stones and chains that had weighed down her body could never diminish the impact of her actions or the legacy she left behind. She had given her life protecting children, and her death had exposed a killer while inspiring countless others to follow her example of moral courage. Margaret Walsh was buried in Millbrook Cemetery on a hill overlooking the lake where her body had been found. Her gravestone bore a simple inscription: "She protected children and paid the ultimate price for her courage." Every year on the anniversary of her death, the community gathered at her grave to remember her life and renew their commitment to protecting the innocent and speaking out against injustice. Margaret's story had ended tragically, but her legacy would live on forever in the lives of the children she had saved and the people she had inspired to choose courage over comfort when confronted with evil.